Save it for the bar. All right, you ready?
I love that.
Well, hopefully this presentation will provoke some conversation as well, because it would be very helpful. Glad to go last. Last time I went first. But all the presentations were really great, so thank you guys for that. This is a little bit of a new sort of like area of inquiry for myself. The title is remezcla, which is mezcla means mix in Spanish, and so I'm taking remix from that. And I'm looking at a digital formation of what I'm calling sort of a Latino genre of music happening in the U.S. And so I've always traditionally looked at sort of like strictly political communication, big P, as Luisa said. But I want to look at some ways that politics happens, little p, through different sort of media and mediums and different types of communication. So this first picture is from the Latin Grammys, which just happened. And these two very popular sort of Spanish language music bands, Latino music bands, Maná and Los Tigres del Norte, wrote sort of, they performed this song called Somos Americanos, so we're Americans. And then at the very end, they unfurled this banner that said, we're not going to vote for racists, right? And so it's a direct response sort of to the nativist language of Donald Trump. And I'm going to come back to this later because in general, I think sort of for an underrepresented community of Latinos in the United States, which lacks sort of political leaders, we oftentimes turn to popular musicians to speak for us and represent sort of Latino voices in the U.S. But I'm going to come back to that because I think that's an important point. What prompts this sort of study was sort of some self-reflection about my own sort of consumption of Latino music. So this is a playlist that I created when I was a senior in college, and it kind of came to me in the middle of the night. I stayed up all night throwing it together. And so LC stands for Latino Community. This is my own sort of like cute way of saying that. And it's sort of been built upon throughout my last few years. And if you look at the songs, I mean, the only underlying sort of thread between them all is the Spanish language. One is there's cumbia, there's border music, there's traditional pop. I mean, there's all this kind of just genres mixed in. But at the time, I didn't see them as different genres. I saw them as one sort of genre. And the rise of sort of streaming music services, which allow people to create playlists, and also the sort of rise that I've been noticing for a long time was sort of this dominant pan-ethnic Latino sort of rhetoric, I think are interesting because this is a form of way of where people and sort of regular folks can sort of contribute to that and form their own sense of what identity is. My own sort of sense of my Latino-ness started with music. And I've always been sort of an active listener of music, but I've never been a performer or anything like that. But now I can say, I guess I've become a producer of music. And so, again, the rationale for this is, we're starting to try to create knowledge and understanding of what Latino means to us. And so I stumbled upon this Spotify Insights data set, which it's their own sort of institutional like stats creating machine, knowledge creating machine. And I don't know the metrics because they didn't reveal them, the methodology, but to them, they wanted to know which are the most loyal genre listeners in the US. And for them, I mean, it's ridiculous. Regional Mexican listeners are the most loyal genre listeners in the US to one. So that means I guess according to the sort of just discerning this, it means that regional Mexican listeners listen to nothing else except for regional Mexican music. And then if you look at number 2, it's Latin pop. And so remember earlier when I said about artists speaking on the behalf of Latinos? Well, the flip side of that is my favorite target of ire in popular music, our friend Pitbull. And it's sort of a recent documentary that came on HBO. I'd encourage you all to watch. It's called The Latin Explosion, the evolution of Latin music, or something along those lines. At the very end, he makes this comment. He's shown sort of like shilling vodka, shilling Pepsi, other sort of brands, and he says, look, the reason why all these brands want to market to Latinos is because we're a very loyal culture. And they know that if they hit us once, we will be loyal to that sort of brand. And so that's the flip side to me of privileging sort of these popular artists that are products of sort of industrial system to speak for Latinos. And so this comes to sort of what I wanted to look at was how then are actual people coming to understand their Latinoness through music, and sort of how are they constructing racial identities, racial formation through their expression of music. And so the first question it just gets at that: how do they construct their own Latino playlist, quote unquote, as a signifier, and then how does this transformation mirror sort of the subsuming of different racial and ethnic sort of groupings into this large pan-ethnic identity of Mexicans and Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, different social classes, different ethnic differences, different racial differences within those communities into this one sort of large overarching signifier that's contrasted against white, black, Latino, right? So it's this new racial identity, quote unquote. To go off of, to kind of like inquire into this, I wanted to tap into sort of three distinct sort of fields of bodies of work, and then ask some critical questions about each that take them in new directions and sort of inform the study. So the very, very sort of well-regarded theory, racial formation theory, just basically posits that race is a category that's politically formed. It's not sort of this essential category that people just have. But the selection of their physical stereotypes, phenotypes, excuse me, are politically chosen for specific reasons. Typically either to support whether it was colonialism, mercantilism, a lot of other different political economic systems. And so I wanted to take that theory and attempt to understand it in a digitally mediated landscape. I mean, Latino-ness is being formed possibly, it's one of the major ethnic categories, racial categories. It's being formed in sort of this 21st century whereas other racial categories were brought about in different areas. So what does it mean to be digitally mediated? I also looked at how Latino music itself, emerging from Latin America, different folk practices, different ethnic groups, different regions, different countries as an expression of hybridity in the Latino community or communities, and also how states and societies and power relations have shaped specific genres of music. So, for example, cumbia was elevated as the Colombian music because it sort of had a little bit of whiteness, a little bit of blackness, and a little bit of Native Americanness. But right, sort of the blackness and Native Americans were eventually kind of like shuffled to the side, and the whiteness of it was upheld, and it became a transnational, international genre of music. It's very popular in Mexico, in the United States, and I think there's cumbia clubs like in Europe that are completely disassociated with the historical legacy of cumbia. And then I looked at Aram's book, Mashed Up, and was grappling with this idea of configurable culture, or otherwise known as remix culture and convergence culture. And there was a particular section in your book that struck me as you were saying that you wanted to analyze sort of the relations between industry practices and production of media, but not the relationship between social groups sort of playing off of each other in terms of their music consumption. But I thought with that sort of theory already out there, it would be interesting to see how this is playing out in sort of this emerging group. And so methods. So the methods section of this paper presented a little bit of a problem, some problems which I'll get into. Mostly because the Spotify application, or the desktop client, is not the most user-friendly client in terms of the information it provides. It provides very good content. There's tons out there, but it doesn't tell you much about how you got there. And so Spotify estimates that there's over 1.5 billion playlists out there, more than there are users. So that means users are creating multiple playlists, right? And different expressions of their identity. And so my first sort of entreaty into this was just to type in Latino into the search API and see what kind came out. And there was just this giant, massive sort of output, of just really like very diverse sort of sets of music. And so I mean, there's one that's like anime in Spanish with Latino music. There's a party one. There's slow songs. There's fast songs. And then Spotify itself sort of publishes and curates its own Latino playlist and sort of makes its function of taste there. So one, it's a question of the size of the data set and the possibilities of sort of analyzing big data, which at the moment I don't have the tool sort of to do. So cognizant of sort of the provocations of Boyd and Crawford, I wanted to cut it down, use a convenient sample, select some good playlists that were clearly made by American users, and were also generically Latino. So they just said Latino. It didn't say cumbias, it didn't say reggaeton, it didn't say other genres, but rather it said, you know, Latino fiesta or Latino playlist or Latino mix 2015. Okay. And so looking at that qualitative approach and looking through all these playlists, my general sense of just average users' creation of what it means to be Latino through music was a subsuming of all these different genres, sort of similar to my own playlist. But what I thought was most interesting, and it's not particularly on here, but what's most interesting is that the genres that are selected are typically genres that are close to or approximately pop music, right? So, you know, what it means to be Latino music ends up becoming sort of popular music, pop music, very industrial, sort of less folk practices of Latino music, right? So, Enrique Iglesias, Shakira, Pitbull again, going back to him, become sort of elevated, and within their own musical stylings, they draw upon a lot of genres, but they don't explicitly sort of always acknowledge that. So to me, it's a elevating of sort of this cosmopolitan sense of Latino-ness, which is we're transnational, we're cool, we tap into all these different cultures, we represent this ultimate hybridity, but there's a disassociation from the historical and political realism in which those different ethnic groups come from, the folk practices of the music, what it meant, what it sort of meant for communities sort of in Panama to dance on the beach to cumbias as sort of a mating and sort of a mating ritual, right? And so I think that's the important takeaway, is that Latino-ness is becoming sort of this empty almost signifier for me of sort of cosmopolitan, transnational. We're here, we're going to take, as Pitbull says, take back the White House and build wealth. And so that had become sort of the political goal of these artists. And so I wrote this continuing sentence about this assuming of the different and diverse musical styles as a metaphor for this assuming of different racial and ethnic groupings in the U.S. And the last thing I'll say is that I think this also provokes sort of a new method of analysis, just because of my own struggles to look at Spotify as a unit of analysis playlist. So, that's it. Questions? Yes.
Maybe not for this particular paper, but maybe later. Are you planning to maybe compare the Latino food and the Latino food here and the perception?
I'd love to do that. Just as much as I'm a fan of music, I'm a fan of Latino food and the difficulty of getting authentic tacos here in the district. And I think authenticity itself is a discourse that weaves through all of this, which I talked about a little bit in the paper.
How do you prepare your planning also to analyze the phenotype of these artists, like as an addition to?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I mean, if you look at who are the most popular artists right now in the U.S., I mean, there's definitely sort of this blanqueamiento, right? That's the term, whitewashing, sort of making a better race, quote unquote. Shakira, clearly. I mean, you know, and that's a definite aspect, and it comes up in the paper. But I think it's also a study worth pursuing as well, because you know who we choose to represent us matters a lot.
I was just going to make one observation and maybe one question. I guess I'm questioning the idea, and it's a problem with this medium and the context it doesn't give you, but I'm questioning playlists as expression of identity.
Sure.
Like just thinking about my own playlist, like I have a French dinner party mix. That doesn't mean I think I'm French sometimes. Or like I have Gypsy Kings like
Sure.
playlists because they're amazing. I don't know. So with more context, I feel like you could
I think
get to that. I don't know.
I think I mean, not to pick on you, but sort of you know, if you have a French dinner party playlist, that's an aspirational sort of like expression of your identity. It's like I want to be classy and you know have this French music that makes me seem cultured and stuff. And I think you know negotiations of the authenticity class are particularly prevalent in Latino music. I mean, what kind of music that you listen to tells signifies to others where your class position is. I mean, if you listen to border regional Mexican, that kind of music signifies lower class, versus if you're listening to, I don't know, more authentic quote, so it signifies your taste, all that kind of things. a very Berdurian sense.
And then again, this is more like along the lines of your other work, but this idea, if I'm understanding your conclusion, of this pan-ethnic Latino identity,
Sure.
or the emergence of that, and whether or not that's playing out politically. Like two of the biggest artists you named are Cuban and Republican.
Yeah.
Which is a big disconnect, I would think, from the Latino political
Right.
identity that may be formed.
There's, I didn't get into it, but there's this whole history of who emerged as sort of the first class of Latino leaders in different fields. And in marketing, at least, a lot of them were either refugees or expatriates from the Cuban Revolution, or their direct descendants. And their sort of vision of what this community meant and what they, quote unquote, sold to the white mainstream of marketers ends up becoming sort of the conception we have: value-driven, conservative, loyal.
There are very historically contingent reasons for that.
Yeah.
It's not
Right.
arbitrary
Yeah.
or essential.
And that's kind of what I'm trying to uncover through these different sort of
Yeah.
points, is that these things aren't natural representations of this group that everybody wants to figure out and sell to. They're all constructions.
So we're just about out of time, but I want to point out really quickly, there are two major fields of research that directly bear on this. One of them is this kind of previous generation of cultural studies, people like Larry Grossberg, George Lipsitz,
Yeah.
People who are looking specifically at how, there's a whole kind of subfield of work done on the construction of Latino identity through music in California. There's a great piece called, I think by Lipsitz, called Cruising on the Historical Block. You know that piece?
I read Asini Hernandez, who cites Lipsitz a lot, because I think he was her advisor.
Okay,
So-
yeah. So anyway, there's you're tapping into a long conversation.
Yeah.
What's interesting to me about this is bringing in the kind of configurable culture dimensions. I don't say this self-servingly, but there is a new kind of strain of research that we began to talk about in the last couple of weeks of the semester that has to do with the ethics of algorithms
Right.
and the politics of algorithms. And I think there's something here about the kind of ontology of music genre within a service like Spotify, and what kinds of affordances those services offer to people who are looking to create identity articulations through musical taste, right? And that is all stuff that's been published in the last 5 or 10 years. So if you want to, I think this is a really interesting project, and I can tell it's very personal for you, but if you want to develop it towards something publishable, you're going to have to bring both of those conversations into the paper.
Yeah, I kind of got a little bit into sort of the ontology of genre and what its intellectual history was.
Okay, cool.
It's
And
in
that
there.
actually goes back to the 70s also, to
Yeah.
like kind of film criticism.
Sure. Thanks for the conversation.
Sure. All right, so we're out of time. I can honestly say I'm looking forward to all 8 of your